So let's talk about training. Can you kind of give me a breakdown of what the training is for an officer when they come into the NYPD? Because this is the first place they go once they are recruited, correct?
Correct, yes. So when we hire them, they come here to our police academy. They will spend just about 6 months here in training. It's a very rigorous academic and physical curriculum that they go through. We challenge them academically, we challenge them mentally, we challenge them physically. There are three main disciplines, academic disciplines that they go through: law, police science, and social science, as well as physical tactics, physical conditioning that they go through, and then all kinds of other things that get added onto that, right? So you think about emergency driving, right? They go through our driver training course out at Floyd Bennett Field, and firearms and tactics that gets done up at our firing range up at Rodman's Neck in the Bronx. The curriculum itself, as we said, is academically rigorous. It's actually accredited for 36 college credits, and those credits are accepted by more than 1,000 colleges and universities across the country.
How many hours of training total does an officer have before they go out onto the street?
So that 6 months worth of training that they get adds up to about 913 hours.
Is that on point with other police departments around the country?
So it actually exceeds it. So New York State requires 639 hours in their basic police officer course, and again, we do 913 hours here in New York City.
So can you talk a little bit about the trainings that we witnessed while we were walking around? I know we saw what is that called, the basic training that you would say?
No, so this is all the state would call this the basic police officer course, right? We just call it recruit training. So we saw a gym block, so we saw some officers doing physical exercising, right? They were running some laps, they did push-ups, some mountain climbers, some other calisthenics out there. Then we saw them do the job standards test, right? 6 different obstacles that they have to surmount in order to graduate from the academy, and those are supposed to simulate typical tasks that an officer might have to perform, right? So they had to surmount an obstacle, they had to run the equivalent of 4 flights of stairs, sprint about 100 yards, struggle with a push-pull machine that simulates a struggle with a 180-pound adversary, do a rescue drag where they drag a 180-pound dummy for a prescribed distance, and then pull the trigger on a firearm with both their strong and weak hands.
And pulling that trigger is after they've already been through all the other stuff.
Right, so after all that physical exertion, and they have to complete all of that in 3 minutes and 22 seconds.
What is, the difficulty that arises when they get to pulling the trigger ultimately? What are you trying to simulate?
So it's really to see whether or not they still have the physical strength and dexterity to do it. After all of that physical exertion, right, which again doesn't sound like a lot, it's 3 minutes, right? But what we saw, they're pretty tired at the end of it, and they're in great shape, right? They're also wearing a 15-pound weighted vest while they do it to simulate the equipment that an officer would carry. So if you've done any kind of exercising, your muscles get tired, and they reach a point of exhaustion, and you just can't do it anymore. And so we want to make sure that they can do it if they have to.
So we saw both female and male police officers doing the same training. Is that the case across the board?
Absolutely, right? So this is one job, it's one standard that everybody has to meet, right? We don't differentiate, everybody meets the same standard.
Was it always that way?
No, it wasn't. That actually changed in 2005. Before that, there were different standards based not only on gender, but also by age, right? So if you were an older recruit, right, you had more time to do it than perhaps a younger recruit would. But in the real world, none of that matters, right? So it's one job, one standard.
So all of this is done inside. How much of the training goes on out in the field? When do they actually get to go out and experience the real life situation, the people screaming, all of the other things that you would deal with?
So we try to prepare them for a lot of that while they're still here, and we walked through some of those environments, and we did see a couple of those scenarios take place either on the simulator or in the real world environment. We saw that scenario there in the train station with the emotionally disturbed person. So we try to simulate as much of that for them here as we can, and in that environment, really what we're trying to do is train to an outcome. And so we give them a variety of skills that we ask them to perfect, and then in that scenario environment, we want them to bring all of those skills together to achieve a very positive outcome to the case. When they go out in the field, so they leave here after 6 months, and then they go into 6 months worth of field training, where they work with experienced police officers that are specifically selected for that task, and that they're given additional training beyond what a normal officer gets, so that then they can train our officers out in the field.
I want to talk a little bit. We were in the one room where they were approaching I believe she was homeless.
Mm-hmm.
The one officer pulled out a taser. The other officer pulled out a gun. What kind of training do the officers receive in terms of choosing? Do I pick a taser? Do I pick the gun? What is the training they receive in deciding that?
So everything we do here centers around de-escalation. right? And that's fairly new. We've only been doing that for about 6 or 7 years now. And again, de-escalation to me is an outcome, right? There's a lot of different tools that go into that. So we teach the officers to use those tools and then hope that they choose the best one in the circumstance. But the truth is, there is no script to this. There is no way that we can tell these officers, if this happens, your response is that. Right? Human interactions are just too complex and too unpredictable. What worked for you perfectly in that identical scenario 30 minutes earlier is not going to work at all in the same fact pattern 30 minutes later because of those human interactions. So we give them a variety of tools, and key amongst all of them is communication. They need to be able to effectively communicate with people. And that's one of the ways that we get that voluntary compliance. But really the keys to effective de-escalation, there's 3 things that they have to be able to do that. And we call it time, distance, and cover. And if you have distance and cover, you've just bought yourself time, right? Some of the debriefs that went on after that, asking the officers, could they have stayed behind the chain link fence? Yes, she can't get at them if they're on the other side of the fence, and yet they can still communicate effectively. They've just given themselves both distance and cover, and now they can buy more time to communicate and get a compliant outcome.
Has training changed at all since what we saw happen out, I believe it was in Brooklyn Center with Dante Wright? Has training at all changed for officers when it comes to using their taser?
So we train tasers maybe a little bit differently than other agencies do. And if you took notice of the way that our officers were carrying their tasers, right, they all wear it on their non-dominant side, right? So a right-handed person like myself, I would have a firearm on my right hip, my taser would be carried on my left hip. We also then train them to draw and utilize that taser with their non-dominant hand, and that's to avoid what's called weapon confusion. What happened there in Brooklyn Center, absolutely tragic, a horrific event. And that's what it appears to be, is what we term weapon confusion. The officer thought that she had a taser in her hand. She actually had a firearm. Other agencies don't do that. They either cross-draw, so everything is done with the dominant hand. We take additional precautions, and we drill that with them constantly so that you know which weapon is in your hand at any given moment.
Okay, I'm going to switch gears a little bit back to use of force, but you know, I've covered a lot of shootings involving police officers, and the most common thing I hear from the person on the street is why they have to shoot to kill the person. Is the NYPD, do they teach officers to shoot to kill? Is that the correct terminology? Or what is the terminology in terms of shooting a person if you have to use deadly force?
Right, so obviously no officer wants to shoot anyone. Sometimes they're not left with a choice, right? That's a necessary decision that they have to make, either to protect themselves, another officer, or a civilian on the street. We don't shoot to kill. We train our officers to shoot to stop. What does that mean? They shoot to end the threat. So we teach them to shoot center mass, right? So that's this torso area of the body, because it is the largest area of the body, and it's the least mobile area of the body, right? If you think about trying to hit an extremity, and depending on what the person is armed with, that's not going to stop the threat. And so I've been to many shootings myself. I've seen people who have been shot more than a dozen times and continued shooting back at the police. And there's some very famous shootouts across the country where that's occurred, right? So we don't want to kill anybody. We teach our officers to shoot to stop the threat, and then they immediately render aid.
To the person that says, you know, I saw in Law and Order that they got shot in the hand, the gun was shot out of their hand. What's your response to that?
It's impossible in the real world. It really is. You add in stress, adrenaline, you know, and if you look at our shootings historically, there are plenty of times we shoot at somebody and we don't hit them. You know, we're not out there looking to kill anybody. No police department in the country can shoot a gun out of somebody's hand, certainly not in a stressful situation. There's also, this is a very crowded city. There's bystanders everywhere. It's a city of 8.5 million people. The last thing we want is for that bullet to pass down the street and strike a bystander.
So talk to me a little bit about the officers who are out there. They're already out there. How often are they retrained on things like their taser, on use of force? How often do they come back in for retraining on that?
So every officer comes back in for at least 5 days a year, and most of them for more than that, depending on the topic that we're covered. They are all retrained with firearms twice a year. They are all retrained and certified with their taser at least once a year. In terms of other tactics, our training continually evolves. Sometimes there's external factors that change our training. Sometimes it's just good practice, that we look at what's going on around the world and we adapt to the changing circumstance. You and I had spoken a little bit earlier about the protests of last summer. So when we looked at that and we looked at the criticism that we got, not just externally, said, Department of Investigation was very critical in their report, and they criticized the lack of training that officers received in policing protests. The unions were equally critical and said the same thing, that we sent our officers out there poorly trained. They were right, and the commissioner acknowledged that they were right. We sat down here in the training bureau with the team, and we created an entirely new curriculum, not just that these recruit officers will experience, but that all of our in-service officers are coming through, and we call it constitutional policing at community events. And it deals with a whole range of things, not just protests. And it focuses on protecting people's right to protest and the 5 freedoms guaranteed by the First Amendment, and de-escalation, crowd psychology. We added all of that in for our officers, again, to give them the tools that they need to more effectively do their jobs.
How long have you been a police officer?
I have been a police officer. I'll finish 31 years next month.
What changes have you seen compared to when you started? What was it like when you started that job?
Well, de-escalation wasn't a word that I ever heard before. And that's not to say that we didn't practice it, because I learned from some very experienced officers who told me, even early on in my career, don't fight unless you have to, right? You never want to fight. You always want to try to get to talk somebody into handcuffs. And some of those officers were really smooth talkers. And you learned from watching them, and you could do that very successfully. I didn't have all the tools at my disposal that these officers had. We didn't get taught communication. We didn't get taught active listening. We didn't have tasers. We didn't have pepper spray. We didn't have expandable batons. Our use of force training on a simulator was basically shoot or don't shoot. There was no other option available to us, and it's progressed so far beyond that today.
Can you talk to me a little bit about, the training that we continue to see? We see in the news all these different. There goes my wire. Hopefully that was not the time. Some of the changes that you've seen since George Floyd, since Eric Garner. I know there was a big overhaul. I believe there was a change to the patrol guide right before we saw the protests with George Floyd. So a lot of people thought those changes were made in response to what happened with George Floyd. But can you talk about when those changes actually started going into play? I believe there were a bunch right after
Sure.
what happened there.
So let's go back to Eric Garner in the summer of 2014, right? So coming out of, in the aftermath of the Garner incident in 2014, that's when we really first start using the term de-escalation. We retrained all 36,000 police officers at the time in New York City. They were all brought back for 3 days worth of training. And they got training in de-escalation, and they got a refresher course in physical tactics, being able to take a resisting suspect into custody safely with minimal injury to everybody involved. And that's really what that training focused on. In 2016, we rewrote our entire use of force policy. And central to that policy, right at the very beginning, is the sanctity of human life, and that deadly physical force is only to be used as a very last resort. We also included in there, for the very first time, the duty to intervene. So we always had, shouldn't say always had, for a couple of decades, we had a duty to report. So if an officer used excessive force, other officers there that witnessed it had a duty to report that to internal affairs, and their failure to do so was serious misconduct in and of itself, for which they would be disciplined. In 2016, for the first time, we include that duty to intervene. So now you not only had to report it, you had to stop it. Those were the big changes. And then in addition to that, for the first time, we actually started accurately capturing when we use force, when force is used against us, and what types of force that is. And we didn't really have a good picture of that before. All of that then informs training, where we see that there might be deficiencies, where we need to train officers better. Coming after the murder of George Floyd, we've added in now ABLE, which is a curriculum that we're doing in conjunction with the folks at Georgetown University School of Law, Center for Innovative Policing, and it's active bystandership for law enforcement. So while we gave, 5 years ago, we created this duty to intervene, we didn't necessarily give the officers the tools that they needed to be able to effectively do that, particularly if the officer was more experienced than them, maybe a higher ranking officer than them. How could they effectively do that? And that's what this training really seeks to provide our officers with, are the tools, A, to understand as human beings, why we're reluctant to intervene in the first place. This is not something that's unique to law enforcement. This affects airlines, this affects medical staff in operating rooms. Everybody sees that the doctor's making a mistake, that the surgeon is making a mistake. Nobody wants to correct them, even though they know there's going to be a tragic outcome. This is human nature. So we're providing our officers with an understanding of that and the tools that they need to effectively intervene in that.
I know you're providing the training, but how do you make it through an officer's mind that they're not going to be penalized, maybe not by a higher up, but that individual officer? How do you know that they're not going to get pushback from that officer and be held for what they chose to intervene, and that officer holds it against them?
Mm-hmm. So that comes to culture. Right? And how do you really change culture? And that starts from the top, right? So the police commissioner has messaged that that is important. Every officer in the department, starting with the police commissioner, will receive that training as a way of showing the department's commitment to it. I myself am a certified instructor for that curriculum so that I can teach my peers that. And really the way it's presented to the officers is that this is a way to keep you safe. Right? So this not only keeps the public safe, and when we think about interventions, we think about George Floyd. I mean, you know, that image of Derek Chauvin with his knee on George Floyd's neck while 3 officers stand there and do nothing really, or effectively nothing, is horrific and mind-boggling to anyone in law enforcement. But there's really so many other areas where interventions can take place, and that if it's done right, it's not that you're stopping that, because that never happens. When you see your partner is about to lose his or her temper, we're human beings, we have emotions, and you intervene in that and kind of distract them, what would you even report to internal affairs? My partner was about to lose their temper and I stopped them from doing that, right? All of those successful interventions to change people's behavior and explaining to the officers that this is really for your benefit. This is another way that we keep you safe. We keep you out of harm's way.
When an officer, say they do use force, maybe it's not deadly, but if it is deadly use of force, what kind of retraining, is there a retraining process for that officer to go back over everything, or is it just you're thrown back out there after making sure all is good?
Yeah, so in the rare event that our officers use deadly physical force, first there's a very thorough and comprehensive investigation that's done, and that's conducted by our Force Investigation Division. That's also fairly new for us. Not that we didn't investigate before, we didn't have one central division that did that. It was kind of done borough by borough, maybe a little differently in every borough. And it focused on the question of justification, which is arguably the most important question, but it's not the only question that needs to be answered. So in 2015, we created the Force Investigation Division. They not only look at the actions at the issue of justification, they look at the actions of the officer and all of the officers present in the events leading up to and after, and see, is there anything that we as an agency can learn from this? Are there takeaways from this so that we can have a better outcome next time? Was there a point in this encounter where we could have done something differently and had a different outcome? And if the answer to that is yes, well then it's okay, so is this a failure of training, or is this a failure to follow training? Did we teach you to do it differently and you did something else? Those officers involved then, assuming that the investigation at the end is found that the officers did nothing wrong, that they were both legally justified and within department policy, they will then go for retraining, specific to the areas identified in that particular incident. They'll get a broad sense, but also the firearms and tactics instructors will tailor that training specific to the incidents identified.
I want to talk about something. So I am interviewing another man. He is a retired, we briefly spoke about this, he's a retired NYPD officer. He retired in 2004, long before many of these new things were implemented. But he studies law enforcement, and he's a professor who also, at a law school, who also studies it there and offers information to his students. One of the big things he said to me is that there's not enough training for officers before they go out on the field. And he believes there should be 2 years of training rather than 6 months. He says 6 months is not enough time. You train longer to be a barber or to do other professions. Why is 6 months the standard time? What are your thoughts on a 2-year training program before an officer is handed their gun and shield and allowed to go out on the street?
So there's definitely an argument to be made that training could be better, and particularly in certain areas across the country, right? 6 months is not the standard. In some places in the country, it's 6 weeks, right? So it varies so much state by state, city by city, depending on who's making the rules. I would certainly say that training can absolutely be better. Does better mean more? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I'd really have to see what he had in mind. What would we do for that additional 18 months? Is it more of the same? All of these officers have at least 2 years of college, 60 college credits before we hire them, or the equivalent in full-time military experience. Many of them have bachelor's degrees. Some of them have advanced degrees. It's an interesting question, and it's one that comes up. More is not always better. Better is better.
So another thing he mentions about the 2 years is he believes that in 2 years you can really tell the type of person you're dealing with. So we often hear the phrases, oh, it was a bad apple. That's why that officer had that negative encounter. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that is something that could be you could figure out if there's bad apples in the crowd?
So all of our officers are on probation for 2 years after we hire them. I don't think that you really get a sense of how an officer is going to perform in the real world until they're in the real world, which is why they go out in that field training program and they are closely supervised. As we've said here, we run them through things and make them as realistic as possible, but deep down inside, they still know that it's fake, that they're not in any real danger, that they're not going to get hurt. All of that changes when you put them under real world stressors. People tend to act differently. Do we need to do a better job of weeding out the bad apples in our profession? We absolutely do.
Do you have any solution idea there, or is it?
I think that and I think that the profession has moved this way, that we can now differentiate pretty quickly the difference between an honest error made in good faith, and I think that's important, that not every mistake is misconduct, right? Officer was trying to do the right thing. There's complex areas of law. We already talked about complex human interactions. They made a mistake, but they thought their heart was in the right place. They thought they were doing the right thing. And then between somebody who really doesn't belong in this profession in the first place, that doesn't have the right temperament for it, the right stress tolerance, maybe just the right attitude and disposition, we need to push those people out.
So we hear a lot of talk of police reform, but then there are some people who believe there's no reforming the way police operates now. They want police to be abolished and to start from scratch, throw away the book. What is your response to that? Well,
what are you proposing in the alternative, right? So we've been talking about reform internally forever, as long as I've been here. We change all the time. So I told these officers when they were hired, and if they have friends or family members who are police officers, they're going to tell you the way that things are done that are actually completely different from the way that they're done. 10 years ago, we still used typewriters, right? Policing changes all the time. When it comes to what should the police be involved in, those are conversations we've been having for a long time. Should it be the police who respond to somebody in a mental health crisis? Should they be the first responder? Maybe not. Why do we send police officers to engage the homeless? Homelessness is not a crime. Right? So if we want to redefine what policing should look like, absolutely. But I'll also say that we have to get that model in place and not create a vacuum. Right? So the Yankees wanted a new stadium. They got a new stadium built. They didn't tear down the old one until the new one was up.
The phrase defund the police, how does that go with training?
So sadly, when you cut agency budgets, and particularly an agency like the NYPD, where 92% of the department's budget is really personnel cost, it goes to pay salary and benefits, there's not a lot of discretionary funding left. So when you cut that budget, training is one of the things that's going to suffer, whether intentionally or inadvertently. When there are fewer police officers on the street, there are less officers that we can take off the street and bring in here for a day of training, especially in a time of rising violence, right? We need those officers out there on the street. We want people in the communities to feel safe, and those precinct commanders can't afford to send their officers here for training. So training suffers, and instead of having better trained officers, and I firmly believe that better training leads to better policing, we're not able to train them as thoroughly as we'd like to once they're already out of this academy and in service.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think you covered everything, Katie.
What does compliance mean? How can the general public understand the word compliance, and how do you assure them that if they comply, they won't get hurt?
So what does compliance mean? It means going along with what the officer tells you, right? If you're going to be placed under arrest, the officer says, put your hands behind your back, put your hands behind your back. There's a time and place to argue that. If you feel that you're being unfairly arrested, it's not in the street, right? That's what leads to everybody getting hurt. Our officers do a really good job at getting that voluntary compliance. We use force in less than 3% of all arrests in New York City. 97% of the time, we get voluntary compliance. You don't see those because they're not interesting videos, right? You're only going to see the ones that look bad. And in fairness to the officers involved in those, the use of force is never pretty. There is no good-looking way to take somebody into custody on video that it doesn't look bad. That doesn't necessarily make it bad. It just isn't going to look good. From day one, all of these officers have been taught that they are expected to treat everyone with dignity and respect. I'm not so naive to expect that it always happens, but that is the standard that we shoot for. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. So some of the issues that you're talking about that we've seen in other parts of the country, we are as appalled by as the general public is, because it paints our profession with a bad brush. It paints all of these officers with that same bad brush. And quite frankly, they haven't done anything to deserve it.
When you see a negative outcome in a situation, how does it make you feel as an officer?
Yeah, so obviously we look at them through a different lens, right? There are times that I will look at a video that's circulating online and say, it doesn't look great, but I understand why the officer did what they did, and it's really not bad. Again, it just doesn't look great. When we see something that's bad, I don't think that there's a police officer in this country that looked at that video of Derek Chauvin murdering George Floyd and did not react with horror and anger and revulsion and everything else, and knowing how that was going to paint all of us. And the same thing with some of these videos. And I said, listen, there is no universal training standard for officers in this country. So how are they trained? What are their department's policies? All completely different from ours.
And one last thing, I know you said earlier, I said, people always say they don't want a Monday morning quarterback, and you said
that's our job. That's what we do here in training, is Monday morning quarterback. Why does the football coach watch the game day films, even when the team won? Right, to see what we could do better next time? That's our job. We have the advantage now of body-worn cameras, something else we didn't have when I started. Right? We create a tremendous number of video, probably 150,000 videos a week, and we sample those. And when we see something that's a good training snippet, we push that out into the field. We want everybody to see that, and we want them thinking, if this was you, what would you do in that situation?